pulverized coal. That's the kind of coal we have, that we use. There's one plant in Connecticut that's a different kind of pulverized coal, but pretty much all of the plants that we have are pulverized coal. It's going away. It is simply going away. Again, sort of the counterpart to Exelon, the largest nuclear operator, giving up on building new nuclear. AEP, American Electric Power, the largest, actually the largest privately owned producer of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, has announced that they will never build a pulverized coal plant ever again. Now, they talk about gasification and new coal technologies, but those are still experimental, basically. But they are not going to build any more of them. They're going away. The twin pincers of the environmental regulation. And what is the environmental regulation about? It's about full implementation of the Clean Air Act of 1970, of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. You hear a lot of whining and a lot of complaining about the EPA regulations that are being implemented now. Nearly all of those regulations are simply implementation of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. The fact that the prior administration screwed up the implementation or delayed it means that the chickens are finally coming home to roost all at once, instead of in a phased way as it was supposed to have happened. And what are these regulations about? They are about recognizing the true cost of that power. The coal generation has been subsidized effectively for decades. And you can tote up the numbers, ask the epidemiologists, in terms of the number of people who have died or gotten sick because of those emissions over the many decades. And we are simply bringing those true costs to bear. And also, gas is cheap right now. So the coal plants are having a hard time competing. We have the numbers for the Merrimack plant up in New Hampshire, which is the last large, fully regulated plant. And for various reasons, the plants that are in the competitive markets, it's much harder to know about their economics from the outside. But we know that that plant loses money on every watt of power it sells. It's like one of the old dot-coms, it loses money on every sale, but it makes it up in volume. That's it. But it actually makes it up because they're fleecing the ratepayers in New Hampshire, which, Angie, competitive market's good from that perspective. And, and we know that the plants are losing money, and they will lose more money as the regulations are implemented. So now let me get into a little bit of the news you can use, section, and this is just a really nice graphic illustration which I stole from a guy at Veridity Energy, which is one of the companies that works in this space, who apparently stole it from one of his consultants. And it's just a demonstration of, on the upper left-hand corner, that's Thomas Edison's original power plant on what was on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan. So that's the old. And then down there is the new. Now, this is not a vision, and Amory Lovins and folks like that were putting that 20, 30 years ago, a vision without central station power plants. You still have some of those in this kind of vision of the world. You have a central power plant of some sort. It's a little ambiguous. It's got cooling towers, but that could be a coal plant, but or gas or nuclear. But you have a central power plant. You have a wind farm, but it's a much more complicated world where the customers have on-site generation, combined heat and power, solar on the roof, maybe a little wind turbine. They have storage on site that they share perhaps among a neighborhood. Now, in the electricity business, one of the things that is generally people try to avoid is what they call islanding, when a section of the grid detaches from the main grid. One of the things that may happen is that may no longer become a curse word. That one of the things that may be very deliberate is, under some circumstances, a section of the grid may calve off and be dependent on its own storage or its own generation for a little while, in order to reduce the strain on the major grid, and then at another time come back in again. It's a much more complicated, sophisticated, smarter world, which frankly we can pull off now. We're all walking around with basically computers in our pockets. Why shouldn't we be able to operate this kind of more sophisticated system? And and this is something I put together for another conference, just sort of illustrating how these different conflicting and overlapping policy imperatives are all pulling together. Economic, and it's not just about rates. Anybody here who's ever paid a rate, please raise your hand. No, you paid a bill, right? It's a trick question. That it's, I mean, bill, how much you use times your rate, that's how much you pay. So, sorry. And just let me say one thing before I move on here, because I'm trying to be sensitive of time. Diversification reliability, 2 days after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, one type of generation in Japan was producing at 100% of its rated capacity. And that was the wind farms, including the 3 near-shore, offshore wind farms they have in Japan. These very unique things they have in Japan, these wind farms that are between 3 and 12 meters offshore. It's really spectacular. I should have put a picture of it. If you're driving along a coastal road in Japan, there is basically a line of very tall wind turbines just off the coast, right in your face as you're driving along. I've try to avoid presenting that image on Cape Cod. But, it's, if you don't like 6 miles, how about, anyway. But it's a very different one. But those wind farms were ticking away. And in fact, the Japanese grid operator was sending strongly worded messages to the operator of those wind farms to please squeeze every watt they could out of them, because those wind farms were helping to keep the lights on in a very, very real way. So what does we mean by reliability? During the winter time, when we have cold snaps and natural gas is being consumed for heating and cooling, and as has been pointed out several times today, our electricity system is now very heavily dependent on natural gas. Other kinds of generation are very useful. Well, you ever notice that around here, when it's really cold, it tends to be very, very windy? We had a crisis moment back in 2003 when the infamous cold snap was, that when there was natural gas shortages and there was an electricity shortage, the analysis was done that showed, based on just the Cape Wind project, because there was a meteorological tower out there taking wind measurements where the Cape Wind would be. If Cape Wind had been online on that day, the New England system would not have gone into an emergency condition. So what does reliability mean? Must be looked at in a larger way than just the conventional way. And let me just say one word about popularity. This is still in theory a democracy. So popularity should matter. And also, sometimes the public has pretty good instincts. The public likes solar. I think that's partially based on an observation. The only way solar can hurt you is if the panel falls off the roof and lands on your head. And the public is suspicious of nuclear. I think there is a basic concern about bringing an extremely dangerous substance, highly refined uranium or plutonium, into proximity with people. It's not a bad instinct to argue with, but that popularity can be derived from something. And then to wrap up here, and this is, it was alluded to just a moment ago about EPA regulations. Well, EPA regulations, national regulations of the fossil fuels that we use, can be very good for our economy here in Massachusetts. It's a leveling of the playing field. There's an effort in Congress these days to derail some of the regulations that have been proposed that are the much belated implementation of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. And our friends at the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, it's not their highest priority, but it's their stated position, are squarely against that effort, because they recognize that leveling the playing field, bringing the other parts of the country into line with the regulations that we are implementing here in Massachusetts would be good for the economy, in terms of taking away the argument that business is going to move to where the power is cheaper, because we're going to take away the artificial subsidization that power has long enjoyed there. And then I'm going to skip over this last point about the role of feds and the states. Basically, one of the things that Power Options has been doing, working with a lot of other folks, has been using the tools of the federally regulated system to be able to reward customer-based stuff, energy efficiency and distributed resources. And that runs a little counter to the basic position that a lot of folks have, which is we should trust the states more than the federal system. But we should use the tools we have. And then, so my final point there is the only thing you can't do is nothing. That, your choice here is, do you want to eat the dinner or do you want to be the entree? And you have a fundamental choice about whether you're going to affirmatively take steps to win and get benefit from the change, or just have it overtake you. And as the folks who are involved in trying to nail shut the coffin on things like the Salem Harbor Power Plant, I can tell you that the change is coming and the change is underway, and we urge you to take advantage of it.